Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential leaders and innovators in the battle against the coronavirus. One of the other system effects of COVID-19 is that it has sown mistrust in global affairs. China and the United States in particular have not pulled together to combat the crisis, but seem to be engaged in a zero-sum game, bashing each other on economic issues and on science, as well as the transparency about the early days of this pandemic. President Trump was skeptical of the international system and an American hyper-nationalist before COVID struck. But since the pandemic began, he has sped up America's seeming disengagement from global institutions, declaring, for instance, America's intention to withdraw from the World Health Organization. Will this pandemic be one of those punctuation points in history, marking the rise of China and the slipping in status and power of the United States, sort of America's own Suez Crisis moment, where the world's eyes saw a lack of leadership from the United States during a dark time for all nations? Parag Khanna, one of the world's most sought-after global strategic advisors, author of the recently released The Future is Asian, and one of the most informed analysts I know on global supply chains and influence networks, joins us now from Singapore, where it's the middle of the night. Parag, thanks so much for joining me. You and I have talked a lot about, Suez Crisis moments and, how power takes shape in the world and why, to a certain degree, boundaries and nations matter less than supply chains and other kinds of influence. I'd love to just get your strategic dashboard in the era of COVID about what has changed and what hasn't.
It's great to see you, Steve, and that is definitely the right place to start. Look, I think one of the most important fundamental systemic or structural realities that people are starting to perceive as entrenching itself in the post-COVID world really began quite a few years ago. And that is that the world is drifting into these large regional clusters, North America, Europe, and Asia. Now, just look at the North American story. We know that because of the trade war, the U.S. was conducting more bilateral trade annually. The trade volume with Canada and with Mexico, each larger than U.S. trade with China. And that's, again, pre-pandemic. Now we're in a situation where, of course, we don't know when borders are reopen, when international travel will be possible. We have pressures for nearshoring, protectionism, industrial policy, subsidies, all of these steps that are being taken to ensure that actually we wind up doing more internally and with our neighbors than with other parts of the world. So that regionalism that was already there is certainly going to accelerate. Definitely applies to Europe. Look at what they're doing with industrial policy as well. They're not giving any federal support to businesses or firms that aren't domiciled in Europe. They've declared a whole raft, hundreds of billions of dollars now of fiscal support, and now new funds, tens of billions, that will be devoted towards strengthening European strategic industries, everything from, for example, clean tech and a bit in information IT as well. And then Asia is already 60% internal trade. Most countries in this region have China as their largest trading partner. You have actually the only region of the world where you generally have trade liberalization going on is here because there's so many complementarities across the economy. So again, number one big picture, whether you're talking about pre-COVID, during COVID, in the next 5 to 10 years, is going to be this almost Orwellian system of three regional clusters that act increasingly, independently of each other, because the more decoupling you have, whether it's strategic in terms of alliances, such as the US and European Union drifting and not getting along as much, which is, of course, a 20-year process, or, of course, the decoupling across the Pacific, you now have these independent poles of power. In the case of Asia, actually multipolar within Asia. And they're going to really have their own playbooks, their own rule books moving forward. So I can tell you, Steve, no matter what happens in our election this November, we're going to be in that multi-regional, multipolar world 10 years from now, 15 years from now.
When you speak to American CEOs of large multinationals, they have spent a lot of time, building supply chains and resources and production networks that span the world because they saw the world as their market, notwithstanding what you just shared. But it's almost like COVID struck and they said, oh my gosh, we have a lot of dependency on China. Our active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. Across the board, much of the supply chain is embedded or has a foot in China, processed in Singapore, and they're out there. So even though I buy what you're saying about the clustering, there's sort of this wake-up call that Americans are feeling right now about moving that more quickly. And as you talk to CEOs, they just say, look, people don't understand it. I'm interested in what you think about can be done in the near term on those supply chain dependencies.
So to want to diminish that single point of failure or excessive dependency to having too many eggs in the China basket in critical industries, components, and pharmaceuticals being medical equipment being an obvious area now, is not to say that one wants to retrench all supply chains back home. Principally, what's happening is that countries are shifting them to Vietnam or the Philippines or Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries in the region that are not China, particularly if there are countries that have obviously more liberal political economies, better protection of intellectual property, and obviously countries that are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, even though the U.S. is not. And so, because Mexico is, Canada is, and so forth. So I'm not saying that all supply chains are going to shrink back into that regional nexus, because since you asked what do executives say, well, let me make sure that it's clear that everyone understands that the first thing that American executives say is that I really wish we had joined the Belt and Road Initiative, because they want to be global companies. American companies are large, many of them are global companies. They enjoy massive revenues from Asia, and they realize that you have to make where you sell. And so whether it is tractors, whether it's semiconductors, and whether it's because of China's regulations that force you to make onshore, like Apple iPhones, or whether it's because you just want to be close to your customers and be right there in the market, you do have to make things in Asia to sell them in Asia. And if you're not selling them in Asia, then your stock market valuation is obviously 75 or 25% or 50% higher than it should be. So American companies want to remain global, but they just don't want to be vulnerable to supply chain cutoffs if there's a pandemic that emerges from Wuhan and your car parts come from there, or obviously the political risk involved in having too many eggs in the China basket. So I endorse the constant shifting of supply chains as needed to maintain their efficiency, redundancy, resilience, and so forth. And so the dilemma that American executives face is no different from the dilemma that every other CEO faces.
How do you grade America's global behavior during the COVID crisis?
Well, I mean, global behavior is obviously a very broad question.
Well, let's say grade America's global leadership in the time of COVID.
Well, it's obviously been absent. I know obviously many other guests on your program have surely said that as well. But when it comes to crisis response, of course, the U.S. has been absent. It's not to say that China has genuinely filled the gap. It's one thing to be lighting fire to the house and then coming around with a fire hose, right? So China has lost a tremendous amount of credibility in this situation as well. But obviously, the U.S. with its own response and by being accused of, confiscating medical equipment bound for other countries, pulling out of the WHO and so forth, the U.S. hasn't been a great leader in this regard either. But global health has never been one of these areas where multilateral coordination was strong, authoritative, and the central locus of activity, right? Unlike, let's say the WTO, which is far more significant. It's not to say, though, that the situation can't be corrected. But right now, I think what the U.S. has lacked during COVID and seems to be lacking even as much of the world is starting to come out of COVID is a kind of global strategy anyway. So even if COVID had not existed, as you well know, we wouldn't really be giving high marks in terms of coherent global leadership from the U.S.
You've written for The Hill about the Suez Crisis, which really was the punctuation point for the rise, the impression the world had that the United States was at the helm of global affairs and the United Kingdom receded. Do you think this is that moment, or has it already happened?
Well, when it comes to, sort of the shoe being on the other foot and the idea that China is going to exploit this moment of, weakness by the U.S., economic as well as strategic, to make inroads to displace the U.S., particularly in West Asia, taking as a sort of pivot point or domino a place like Iran, is definitely a scenario that one needs to consider. But it will play out over a longer time horizon, if it does at all, not in the immediate sense of threatening to dump the pound, as was the case in 1956. There's been a lot of talk about what China will do with its very large currency reserves, and particularly in the U.S. dollar. And the consensus is that it would lose more than the U.S. would in such a situation. So the question becomes really, what is, as I said before, China has lost a lot of credibility, a lot of trust, especially here in Asia. I remember back to the moments as the pandemic was really spreading, when Chinese diplomats got very active on Twitter, and you had politicians in Italy, South Africa, Brazil saying, "Oh, we're grateful for China providing medical assistance," and this is mask diplomacy. And I just had to shake my head, because remember that the majority of the human population is people in Asia, people who are in states that are China's neighbors, and every one of them, including myself who lives here in the region, knows where the pandemic came from. We're not going to forget it. So the notion that somehow China would simply send around a lot of surgical masks, faulty as they wound up being, many of them, and somehow use this opportunity to extend its sort of influence globally, was a farce. It's going to take a lot of goodwill for China to build that up. Now, it seems to be wanting to pursue this Suez moment, but through obviously much more assertive and aggressive means. That's part of what's going on in the South China Sea, Senkaku Islands, obviously in Ladakh in India, and in other territorial situations. This also is not going to serve China well, because a lot of these countries are obviously very guarded about the amount of debt they already owe to China, the specific territorial frictions. And this, if anything, could be an opportunity for the U.S. to build a new kind of coalition. I hesitate to use the phrase leading from behind, but the kind of broader set of coalitions or mechanisms that are going to help Asians and China's neighbors and other adversaries to kind of put a stronger stake in the ground and defend their interests.
In your book, The Future is Asian, I haven't looked at it yet. I look forward to it. But how do you treat the United States in that? You treat it as an Asian nation that could have stakes in it, or is this future going to largely occur at the side of America and despite America?
Well, one thing that we have to appreciate is that Asia's rise is structural, not cyclical, right? It's something that began really with Japan after World War II, if you think about it. And I know that's a country you know very, very well. So you've gone through waves of Asian growth since the end of World War II. Japan, the tiger economies, China, now what I call the fourth wave economies of South and Southeast Asia, which you see right behind me, from Pakistan through India through Southeast Asia. So you're talking about 5 billion people, increasingly coherent, 50% of the global economy. Asia is not the future, it's the present, right? So no matter what happens in U.S. policy, Asia is where the action is. It's not something that you can turn around or reverse. And it's not a set of countries that are waiting either for Donald Trump to have a change of heart or for Joe Biden to get elected. Steve, we've known each other a long time. We've gone through every 4 years a cycle of many people on our side of the aisle, our circle of friends, constantly falling back on this refrain that if X gets elected or reelected, the world will be open to American leadership again. That's really not the way geopolitical psychology works when you're talking about a set of countries that have, in recent history, experienced colonialism and the Cold War. The last thing they want is either to be stooges of the United States again or vassals of China. And so you really have to think about the future kind of geopolitical landscape as not being a repeat of either the Cold War or a Chinese kind of neo-colonialism. It's going to be something different. And in that different, Asia is going to play a very prominent role, China within Asia, but in the next phase, we will come to appreciate, in the same way that we see these supply chains coming out of China into Southeast Asia, to India and elsewhere, we're going to appreciate that power is much more diffuse in Asia than we think it is. And that's a very good thing. That's an agenda we should support. That's an agenda that everyone on earth agrees with, except China.
Well, we'll leave it just there. I love the map behind you. It gives us a real nice reorientation for many people watching this show. Parag Khanna, author of The Future is Asian, joining us from Singapore. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for joining me today. We'll see you tomorrow. I'm Steve Clemons. Be well.